If you'd asked me this time last year, or even 6 months ago, what laptop should you buy? Without a question, I'd have said best all-rounder, as the screen goes off, MacBook Air with the latest M3 chip, right? But now, things have got a bit more interesting. We've got Qualcomm Snapdragon chips, we've got Ryzen AI Strix Point processors, we've got the new Intel Core Ultra Series 2, and they are all giving the MacBook with its fantastic Apple Silicon some proper competition in performance, in battery life, in running cool and quietly. You can't get a bad laptop now with these new chips, and they're all fairly similarly priced. We're talking between £1,000 and £1,500-ish. Fairly expensive for these fancy new thin and light laptops, but all this competition also means we're starting to get more affordable options trickling down, like the recently announced Snapdragon Plus 8-core chip, and also Intel's previous generation chips, what they're now calling the Core Ultra Series 1, and these are aiming for the sort of $700 to $1,000 range. So for this video, I'm going to break down the pros and cons of each, and so hopefully by the end of the video, if you're after a new laptop, you've got a better idea of what you want. So let's start with the brand new Intel chips, the Core Ultra Series 2, because Intel have, well, they're not doing very well, generally speaking, and quite frankly, over the last couple of years, they just haven't kept up, and that's why we've seen such fantastic competition from Qualcomm Snapdragon, and to be honest, we've just seen Intel fall behind. But the good news is they have finally caught up, and actually maybe even taken over the rest of these guys. I actually just reviewed this, it's the Asus ZenBook S14, and it's a pretty huge overhaul. They've moved the memory onto the chip itself, they've actually halved the number of cores from 16 down to 8, they've got rid of hyper-threading, which does have its downsides, and we'll come to the results in a second, but it's all in pursuit of efficiency, and therefore also battery life. So these new Intel laptops come with either 16 or 32 gigs of RAM, which as I say is baked in, so you can't upgrade it yourself. We have the latest Wi-Fi 7, Bluetooth 5.4, up to 3 Thunderbolt 4 ports, and 48 TOPS of AI compute performance via their new MPU. I also roll my eyes a little bit when it comes to AI performance because there just isn't that much of a use case for these more powerful MPUs just yet. It's more about future-proofing, but we'll come back to that later. To give you an idea of this efficiency, the base TDP for this top-end Core Ultra 9, the 288V, is around 28 watts, or about 17 watts on the Core Ultra 7, versus 45 watts on the equivalent previous-gen Core Ultra 9. But again, they've halved the cores, got rid of hyper-threading, reduced the TDP. Surely there is a performance trade-off here in order to get this better efficiency and battery life. And the answer is yes, there is, and we'll come to benchmarks in a second. But you can't argue this is a massive overhaul for Intel. From an architecture point of view, from a prioritization of what they think you want out of a thin and light laptop like this, it's exciting stuff, if you're a nerd. But what about AMD? They are back with their new Ryzen AI chips. And my main problem with this is I haven't really seen a ton of laptops using these new chips yet. This is the Asus ZenBook S16, basically the bigger brother to this guy, which runs Lunar Lake, or Core Ultra Series 2. The bigger brother here comes in both Intel and AMD configurations. And actually, when I reviewed this a couple of months ago, I called it the best laptop I've used so far, because this was a real upgrade over the previous gen Intel, properly competitive to Qualcomm and Apple, but now Intel's back in the game. Does this make sense? So these Ryzen AI 300 series are based on AMD's new 4nm Zen 5 architecture. And as I say, so far we've only seen a couple of higher end SKUs running 28 watts, with this guy boasting the 12-core Ryzen AI 9 HX 370. And there's also a slightly cut down 10-core 365, although both up from 8 cores on last gen Zen 4. And AMD say that we're getting about 16% faster IPC, or instructions per clock, than the previous generation. Although from my tests and other reviews I've seen, we're mostly talking single-digit improvements. But we also have their new Radeon 890M integrated GPU, which is based on their much more efficient RDNA 3.5 graphics tech, plus their MPU, which offers a class-leading 50 TOPS of AI compute. So Intel is giving us fewer cores, AMD is actually giving us more cores, but they're both also massively pushing the integrated graphics and also the AI performance. So we have Intel, AMD, and also now Qualcomm. This is the Microsoft Surface Laptop 7th edition, and it is using the Snapdragon X Elite chip. I've been very impressed with just how many laptops have been launched over the last couple of months, since the summer really, with these X Plus or X Elite chips from Snapdragon. I think there's like 20 or something. There's a lot more certainly than we've seen from AMD, and because this is brand new, there's not a ton of these as well. So there's actually a lot of different options from Dell and Asus and Acer and HP, Lenovo, all rocking these chips. This new hardware really shook up the whole PC, or particularly the laptop space this year. And the big story really is that they're based on ARM rather than the more traditional x86 architecture, and both the X Plus and the higher-end X Elite chips offer incredibly efficient designs with fantastic CPU performance and also the best battery life we've ever seen. They run cool, they run quiet, they are ultra responsive, and with similar performance running on battery versus plugged in, they are fantastic all-rounders. And these Snapdragon Power PCs were the first to launch with Windows Copilot Plus features, like live translation, co-creator tool, the recall when they eventually unrecall it and launch it. To be honest though, all this Copilot Plus stuff feels like a bit of a marketing exercise, because I don't think many people use a lot of these features regularly. Some are useful, like Windows Studio Effects for the webcam, and it's basically a proof of concept that with a powerful local NPU running AI accelerated tasks that can offload from the CPU or the GPU and either run it much faster or much more efficiently, thereby giving you better battery life, in theory, fantastic. But it's kind of a chicken or the egg thing where there just isn't that many use cases for these NPUs just yet. But in terms of future-proofing, all these Windows laptops have at least 40 TOPS of AI performance, which is Windows' minimum requirement for these Copilot Plus features. So hopefully we'll see more over time and also more applications utilize it. But certainly there was a lot of excitement, let's just say, about these guys being the first out the gate with Copilot Plus on Windows. The Achilles heel of these otherwise fantastic Snapdragon chips, though, is that being ARM-based, they can't run x86 apps, which are basically every Windows app ever made, natively. So to run an app or a game, it has to be either a specific ARM version, like Windows on ARM, or run via an emulator. And most of the time, it's completely seamless. You may not even know the difference, but there are still plenty of apps that have compatibility issues, whether they don't run as well or they just simply don't run at all. So it's definitely worth doing your research to see whether the apps that you use or your work uses will run on this. However, like the Intel and AMD rivals, at launch, these Snapdragon laptops were also pretty pricey, again in the 1 to 1.5K region, although because some of these laptops have been out for a few months now, we're starting to see some decent deals and discounts, actually making them more affordable than the brand new Intel rivals, and especially with the new 8-core X Plus chip coming out. I think what we're going to see, and this is a little bit of a spoiler for my conclusion, is that these Snapdragon laptops become a bit more of an affordable choice, because the GPU, the graphics, doesn't quite keep up with these guys, and also, obviously, being ARM rather than x86, we do have some app compatibility issues. Because I tell you what, if I could get an 8-core Snapdragon X Plus laptop for 750, 800 quid, I would definitely consider that over a 1,500 pound Intel Core Ultra Series 2 laptop. Then we have the MacBook. This is the MacBook Air 13 with the M3 chip, and there's a reason why this is arguably the benchmark laptop. It's incredibly popular, you get fantastic performance, battery life, it runs cool, it runs quiet, silent in fact, because it doesn't even have a fan. Every other one of these has fans to cool down the chip, but despite that, we're still getting comparable performance. So Apple, with this design, with their own Apple Silicon, have for a few years now since they introduced the M1 and M2 and M3, just blown the competition out of the water, and it's why those annoying YouTubers keep making those videos with titles like, "Is this a MacBook killer?" Of course, I wouldn't do such a thing. And with Apple making the hardware, the silicon, and the software running macOS, that vertical integration gives them a massive advantage. And with the M3 here, we've got an 8-core CPU, 10-core GPU with either 8, 16, or 32 gigs of memory, which, like these new Intel chips, is also baked onto the chip, so you can't upgrade it yourself. Not that you can upgrade really anything about a Mac, that is definitely one of the downsides. The only area it falls behind a little bit is in terms of AI compute performance, although we are going to get Apple Intelligence soon and any M series laptops, so if you've got an M1, M2, M3, or upcoming M4, that will support Apple Intelligence, with new MacBook Pros expected in late October, November time, with new M4 Pro and M4 Max chips, presumably giving us a massive boost in AI performance ahead of Apple Intelligence. As it stands, though, I don't think we're going to see updated MacBook Airs this year. We may have to wait a little bit longer for that. We'll see it on the Pros first. However, the latest iPad Pros, the 11 and 13, do come with a new M4 chip. Obviously, this is going to be a lower power version, also fanless like the Airs, but I ran a couple of quick tests on this versus the M3 and the Air to sort of get a sense of how much faster it might be going to the next generation MacBook Airs with an M4. And in Geekbench 6, the M4 single-core processor speed was up 15%, and the graphics were a ridiculous 82% faster, and this is in an iPad. The other issue is that if you spec up a MacBook Air with more RAM or storage, then you're into MacBook Pro price territory. And of course this does give you more options, and because it's thicker and has a fan, you're going to get better sustained performance, but spec like for like, it is a fair bit pricier. And I would argue it's a different class of laptop, and really, if you're going to go with a MacBook Pro, then it's worth bumping up to an M3 Pro or Max chip anyway, with the M4 series just around the corner. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's concentrate on the here and now. And on this table with me, as I say, we've got the 13-inch MacBook Air with the M3. We've got the ZenBook S14 with the top spec Ultra 9 Series 2 processor. Horrible naming scheme. We've got the Snapdragon X Elite. This is the X1E 80-100, which technically is not the highest end chip. There is an X1E 84-100, but that is only in, as far as I know, the Galaxy Book 4 Edge. No other laptop, no other Snapdragon laptop offers that chip. So broadly speaking, the performance you'll get from this is most likely what you actually get if you went out and bought one of these, unless you got the Samsung one with the highest spec and paid extra for it. Then we've got the ZenBook S16 with the Ryzen AI 9 HX370. Honestly, this video took forever to make. I hope it's useful. So enough waffling, let's jump into some results, and starting with battery life. In my full screen video streaming test, just running my own YouTube playlist because someone's gonna watch my videos, as you would expect, the now rebranded first gen Core Ultra 9 from last year dropped out first after just over 8 hours. No surprises there. Then came the Ryzen AI powered ZenBook S16 at 9 hours 44. The screen is bigger, to be fair, which draws more power, but then the battery is also bigger as well. The MacBook Air 13 lasted a little bit longer, just over 10.5 hours, which is very impressive given its smaller battery. But then the battle for second place, and it goes to the Intel Core Ultra Series 2 in the ZenBook S14, which kicked the bucket at 13 hours 23, with the Snapdragon X Elite in the Surface laptop lasting a whopping 14 hours 41. But hats off to the Snapdragon, that was a clear win for battery life from this guy. But I do want to give credit to this guy as well, because it lasted 68% longer than the previous gen. So this gets the first place trophy, this gets the second place, and I think also the most improved trophy. And the MacBook deserves a trophy for lasting as long as it does on the battery it has inside. It's not just the size, it's what you can do with it. But what about standby life? Well, I charged them all up to 100% and then left them for 15 hours. I came back and these two still had 100% charge left. This guy actually dropped 4% down to 96. I thought we would do better than that actually. And then the Ryzen over here on the ZenBook S16 dropped 2%. But while of course there are a lot of variables, and these are all different laptops from different manufacturers with different screen sizes and battery sizes, you know, this is not a scientific experiment. It was a win for these two in terms of standby time. But let's move on to performance, and let's start with the processor, the CPU. And I'm using the full speed, max performance modes on all of these to see what they are capable of flat out. And of course the MacBook Air will be at a disadvantage here because it doesn't have a fan, but despite that, in my single core CPU tests, Apple's M3 was out front, with the Snapdragon X Elite and the Intel Core Ultra Series 2 just behind, and pretty evenly matched I must say, which is a big step up from Intel's last gen chips. But predictably, because they've halved the number of cores, the new Intel chip doesn't do as well in multi-core, where it's around 25% slower than the equivalent last gen, so quite a drop, and it's outpaced by everything else on test here. I am always amazed though by what Apple's chips can do with so little wattage and also without a fan. And in my battery-only test, so not plugged into the charger, only the Snapdragon X Elite maintained the same results as when plugged in. And having identical on-battery performance is definitely a great feature of these Snapdragon machines. Now moving from the CPU to the GPU, in terms of graphics, in my 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme benchmark, the Core Ultra Series 2 chip and the Apple M3 came out on top, but there was only a single-digit percentage difference between all but the Snapdragon in the Steel Nomad Lite test. In fact, the Snapdragon was significantly behind in both tests. But then in games, the new Intel Ultra 9 Series 2 absolutely took the lead across the board, being anywhere from 20 to 33% faster than the previous gen and outpacing AMD in all but Hitman, where Intel kind of falls apart for some reason. And interestingly, despite sharing the same Arc 140V integrated graphics, the lower powered Core Ultra 7 was a fair bit slower than the same laptop with the higher TDP Core Ultra 9. In both cases though, the XeSS and FSR upscaling are doing a lot of the heavy lifting, getting us well into the playable 1080p 30 or even 60 FPS territory, depending on the game. Again though, the Snapdragon really does struggle to keep up here, but unlike the MacBook Air, at least it can play games, although not as many as the Intel or the AMD. And breathe. That was a lot to take in, but which should you buy? Well, I think the new Intel chips are very impressive. We're getting great all-round performance, fantastic battery life, really good graphics performance, particularly in games, that can legitimately give us performance of a couple-of-year-old dedicated GPU. And while multi-core is significantly down, I think they have been smart about optimizing efficiency, single-core battery, GPU performance. These new Intel laptops, while not perfect, are really good. However, the fairly significantly lower multi-core performance would lead me to say that the Ryzen AI chips like we have in the ZenBook S16, let me get that out of the way, are probably your best option if you are running more demanding tasks regularly. Even if this new chip isn't as impressive an upgrade versus the previous gen, and also, as I say, there just aren't that many options, I should say, compared to some of these other laptops using this chip, or at least not yet. But for the most demanding workloads, running Windows and on x86, so there's no app compatibility issues, get yourself a Ryzen laptop. But this is where it gets tricky, because for pure battery life, get yourself a Snapdragon laptop. Really impressive there in terms of efficiency and just overall performance as well. However, unless this is significantly cheaper, which it may be, not just because of discounts, but also lower end models, I would probably just go with the Intel. You're getting similar performance, similar battery life, although not quite as good, but none of the app compatibility issues, and a much faster GPU. As for the MacBook, well, this is still incredibly easy to recommend. I would argue it's still probably the best overall laptop in terms of form factor, webcam, battery life, not having a fan, so it's silent, keyboard, trackpad, macOS is lovely. As I say, the fact that they designed the chip, the laptop, and the software just means it's a lovely experience. It's not going to be for everyone, and there are advantages to Windows laptops, of course, but then this is also due a refresh in a few months with an M4 chip, which could make it even better. And the base model of this can actually be a fair bit cheaper than these guys. Although, once you upgrade to 16 gigs of RAM and maybe 512 storage, which I would probably recommend, then the pricing is actually pretty similar. What would I buy? Out of these, on balance, I would probably get the Air still. But broadly speaking, if I were to buy a new Windows laptop, I would probably go with the Intel, with the Ultra 7. The combination of overall performance, graphics, battery life, I'd probably go for one of these, but they're not cheap. If you've got any other questions, drop a comment below. I'll do my best to answer it. Let me know out of these guys which one you go for. If you did find this useful, a cheeky like and subscribe would be fantastic. And I will see you next time right here on the Tech Chat.